Okay, now that we've gone over the basics of why we need to swatch in the round and why knitting smaller circumferences is not always the best way to go about it, we're going to start our video on how to swatch flat in the round. So the first thing I'm going to show you is a swatch that I've already done flat in the round. This is a swatch for an upcoming design pullover. And I wanted to obviously check the gauge for the stitch pattern that I'm using. This is what it looks like when you swatch flat in the round. Basically, what you do is you cast on the usual garter stitch border, and you can knit that flat as you normally would because you're not measuring that, and because garter stitches always knit every row. Then you maintain a garter stitch border on both sides, the same as your regular flat swatch. And you work your stitch pattern. In this case I have a pattern stitch, but we'll be doing stockinette. And when you reach the end of your first knit row, instead of turning your work and pulling back, you're going to pull your working yarn behind your swatch to the front of the needle and start again. What you end up with is long strands of yarn around the back of your swatch. This is why this method uses so much extra yarn. So you can see here, these are all the strands of yarn that were running behind my swatch. Then when I was done, I cut them right through the middle so that the swatch would lie flat for easier measuring. But since I'm still knitting every row, or in this case the slip stitch pattern, but because there's no purling, you're still going to get the same gauge that you would if you were actually knitting in the round. All right, let's get started. As with any swatch or project, our first step is to cast on. For the purposes of your homework, I would like you to cast on the same number of stitches that you used for your flat swatch, using the same needles and the same yarn. You can see I'm actually using different yarn, mostly because I ran out of the other yarn, but also because I already know the difference between my flat and in the round knitting, and I want you guys to have an opportunity to check that out. So you'll be able to see the difference if you use the same yarn and needles and you cast on the same number of stitches. All right, so cast on stitches, and then you'll just work the first 4 rows in garter stitch. And as I said, at this point, there's no need to do anything different because you're not measuring your border. It's not necessary for you to do anything different for this part. So you just knit 4 rows of garter stitch. Okay, so now we have our 4 rows of garter stitch for the bottom border. We can get started on the real project. Okay, so the first thing, since we're going to be knitting flat in the round, is that you need to change the way that you work the garter stitch border. Obviously, when you're working flat, you knit every row and that becomes garter stitch. It doesn't work that way when you're working flat in the round though. So we will start the normal way for our first row. We will knit the first 3 stitches for the border, and then we'll knit all the way across. Okay, the end of the row, if we were working flat, you would turn your work and purl back. Instead, we are going to slide the stitches back to the top of the needle. Then we're going to take the working yarn over at this end, pull the stitch taut, and stretch it across the back of the work. Now we don't want this strand to be super tight. We need it to be loose. So pull out extra yarn so that you have a nice loose strand of yarn hanging at the back of your work. Okay, you can see it's hanging loosely at the back. And what I like to do is grip the yarn with my left hand so that when I start to knit, I don't pull it tight by accident. So we've pulled the yarn across the back of the work, and now we're going to purl the first 3 stitches for the border. Once I've worked a couple of stitches, then I'll let go of that strand, maybe pull this part a little bit to tighten it up, and then we'll knit across. Then when we get to the last 3 stitches, we're going to purl them. You can see here is the yarn hanging that you pulled across all the way back here. So this stitch has a tendency to be a little bit loose. Purl the last 3 stitches. So, and then I'm going to tighten up this stitch by pulling on the hanging strand. This loose edge stitches is one of the reasons it's really important to do a border, especially when you're swatching flat in the round, because your edge stitches are going to be looser because of all these hanging strands at the back. Okay, we made it to the end of the row, so again, I'm going to move my yarn to the back. I'm going to pull the stitches back to the top of the needle. I'm going to pull the working yarn, which is over here, all the way across the back, nice and loose. I'm going to hold it in place with my left hand so that it doesn't tighten up. And then I'm going to start again. This time I'm going to knit the first 3 stitches for the border. And then just knit all the way across. So you're going to continue to work your swatch this way. You can add the eyelets, just like we did for the flat swatch, to mark your needle size. They are worked in the exact same way. So if you need a refresher on that, you can just pop back to the first swatching video. So the only difference is you're going to be pulling the working yarn across the back of your swatch, and you're going to be alternating between knitting the first and last 3 stitches and purling the first and last 3 stitches for the border. So you have finished your swatch. Now, since I'm just doing this for illustrative purposes, I did not do a full size swatch, but still get the idea. You can see garter stitch border, stockinette in the middle, garter stitch border on the side. You can also see all of the strands of yarn running behind it. So now what? Your first step is going to be to tighten up these edge stitches just by pulling on the strands, and they will loosen up again, but this is just for our next step. So on one side, pull them all a bit tighter. Over to the other side, pull these a bit tighter. then you're going to turn it over, and you can see all the strands. You're going to go to the approximate middle, and for this I recommend scissors over a yarn cutter. It's just a little bit easier. So right about in the middle, you are going to cut right through them. Okay? Easy peasy. Now, all right, so after you've cut through the strands, you can see that the swatch, in theory, can lie nice and flat for easier measuring, which is much simpler to do when you've got a flat swatch than it is to do if you've got a swatch that you actually knit in the round. But because you pulled the strands behind and knit every row instead of purling, you're going to have more or less the same gauge that you would if you were truly knitting in the round. So that is it for swatching this week. We've gone over how to knit a basic swatch flat and in the round, and we are ready for our next step of the project next week.